Today we are doing station 4 notes, which is 20.3, applying the zero product property to solve equations. And I'll be honest, I think this is one of the quickest, easiest lessons that we've done all year. You should be able to kind of watch this video. Hopefully it's not very long, shouldn't be. And do the homework and do the quiz pretty much in one and a half class periods. That's how short it is. So in this case, let's start looking here. The zero product property, what it does is it says that if I'm multiplying two things together, so if I have A times B, oh, gosh, that didn't help very well, that didn't work very well. So if I have A times B is equal to 0, just think about it for a minute, is if I'm asking you if I'm multiplying two things together, so this is multiplication in here between those two, A times B, but I want to get an answer out of 0. What does one of those two numbers have to be? Hopefully you said it has to be 0, because if I had 3 times something and I know the answer had to be 0, the only way we get an answer out of 0 is if that something was 0. So then what that tells me is if A times B is 0, then either A has to be 0 or B has to be 0. One of the two of them has to be 0. They both could be, but at least one of them has to be. So what that tells us with these type of problems is you have to pretend for a minute, if I'm looking here, this x minus 3 is my A value that we just said up there in the zero product property. So this whole thing right here is like my A. This whole thing, this x plus 8, is like my B value. And I'm multiplying these things two together. That's what the parentheses next to each other means. So I know one of these two things has to be equal to 0. So all we do is we take the first parenthesis, the x minus 3, we set it equal to 0. We take the second set of parentheses, the x plus 8, we set it equal to 0. Now we have two equations that we can solve. If this is x minus 3 equals 0, all I have to do is add 3 to both sides, and I get x equals 3. Here, I just have to subtract 8 to both sides, and I get x equals negative 8. So those are my two answers. Now, if you remember back to the last chapter when we were talking about those parabolas, and the very last thing we kind of talked about were the zeros. These two places right here were called my zeros. Well, these two numbers are the zeros of my quadratic function. And again, some of you are kind of thinking, okay, where did this idea of equal to 0 come from? Let me just try one. If I take my original problem, the x minus 3 times x plus 8 equal to 0. If I take this 3 and plug it in here for the x, well, 3 plus 8 is 11. But when I go to do 3 minus 3 is 0. 0 times 11 is 0. So I do get a true statement. If I did the same thing for the negative 8, it would work on that second set and give me a 0 here in place of the 11. So those are my two answers. Those are my two zeros of the function. Okay, so take a minute and try B. Pause the video, try B. So if I have x minus 10 times x minus 6 equals 0, hopefully in this case, you just took each one of these, x minus 10 equal to 0, x minus 6 equal to 0, and then we just solve each of these. Here in the first one, I'm just going to add 10 to both sides. So I get x equals 10. Here, I'm just adding 6 to both sides, and I would get x equals 6. There's my answers. So sometimes these problems are written with f of x instead of set equal to 0. And what this next statement here is saying is that I just want to replace the f of x with 0. And then I'm using the zero product property like I just did up above. So if I look at this one, f of x equals x minus 10 times x plus 5. what I'm going to do is I'm just replacing this f of x, and I'm going to put 0 in its place. And so then I really have 0 is equal to x minus 10 times x plus 5. And now we can do the exact same thing we just did up above, where I'm taking x minus 10, set it equal to 0. I'm taking x plus 5, setting it equal to 0, and now solving both of these. So here I'm just going to add 10. So I get x equals 10. Here I'm subtracting 5, and so I get x equals negative 5. There's my two answers. So don't let this this f of x confuse you. Just cross it off, replace it with 0. So in this case, I get 0 equals negative 4 times x minus 8. Now, this one kind of confuses some people because it's not two sets of parentheses, but I have this negative 4 right here. This is kind of like that a value. This is my b value. There's the two parts to my problem. So if I set this, I would originally write 0 is equal to negative 4, and I would write x minus 8 is equal to 0. If I go back and look at that first one, 0 equal to negative 4, we know that's not a true statement, so we can just cross it off. There's no variable there. We know that's not true. It's not a true statement. Here, when I have x minus 8 equal to 0, I'm just adding 8 to both sides, so I get x equals 8, and there's my answer. So just, again, stop this video, try it. This one, before you do try it, should be equal to f of x. I think that's a typo there. But try it, see what you get. Okay, hopefully you did try it and you're back. Remember, I'm going to replace this f of x with 0. So now I have 7 times x minus 2, or minus 12, times x plus 13 is equal to 0. So again, technically I'm taking 7 equal to 0. But we know that's not true, so we can just ignore it. Now I'm taking x minus 12 is equal to 0, and I'm taking x plus 13 is equal to 0. And now I can just solve both of these. Here I'm just adding 12 to both sides. So we get x equals 12. And here I'm subtracting 13 to both sides. So we get x equals negative 13. And there's my two answers. That truly is all this lesson is about. The last one is just kind of a word problem that says the height of one diver above the water during a dive can be modeled by the equation. So they gave us the equation where h is the height in feet and t is time. Find the time it takes for the diver to reach the water. Well, first of all, if the diver's hitting the water, that is a height. If it's height in feet, if he's hitting the water, that's a height of 0. So that means I'm just going to take here my height, and it's just going to become a 0. So now I really have 0 is equal to negative 4 times 4t plus 5, and then t minus 3. So in this case then, I'm just doing the same thing we did on the previous slide. I'm just saying negative 4 is equal to 0. Not true, so I'm just going to ignore that. I have 4t plus 5 is equal to 0, and I have t minus 3 is equal to 0. Here, I'm just subtracting 5 on both sides. So 4t is equal to negative 5. Divide by 4. And that tells me that t is equal to negative 5/4. Now, I know we don't like fractions. If you type that in the calculator, you should have also gotten that t was equal to negative 1.25. And then here I'm adding 3 to both sides, so I get t is equal to 3. Now, you might circle both of these answers, but think about it. In this case, t was time. And so I have to look and say, oh, wait, can my time be negative 1.25? It sure cannot. So this, even though we got that as an answer, because it's not realistic to the problem, it's not a valid answer. Here, t equals 3, it is. If the diver's diving in, it might take about 3 seconds to hit the water. And there's my answer. So my only good answer in this case is this t equals 3. That truly, guys, is all there is to 20.3, so the zero product property, and that is station 4. Okay. If you have any questions about anything you watched, you wrote down in your notes as you do the HMH or worksheet, please let me know. I'd be glad to sit down and work with you and explain it in a different way, explain it again to you. Have a great day.